One thing that Norbert shined a light on me a couple of years ago was like, hey, if you build stuff in Storybook in this like component and story kind of model, you get a bunch of things for free.
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host Justin.
Hey everyone.
Today we're going to be talking to two people involved with Storybook, a development tool that has radically changed the way components are developed. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Hi, my name is Dominic. I'm a co-founder of Chromatic, the company behind Storybook, and I work on Storybook design.
Hi, my name is Norbert de Langen. I live in the Netherlands, and I am one of the maintainers of Storybook.
So where did both of you start your career? How did you end up working on an open source project like this?
Yeah, for me, I've started working on open source a couple of years ago, maybe 7 years ago. I'm starting with Meteor, the first full stack JavaScript framework. It's still around. Its popularity has tapered off, but while there, we were thinking about hot module reloading, optimistic UIs, the kind of stuff that you end up seeing in the ecosystem now. And then I moved on to Apollo GraphQL, where we built the GraphQL client libraries and was a part of launching that product. And really what drove me to it is just the kind of freedom and chaos that is in open source. And in that chaos, it's this mineral-rich nebula of ideas that stars are born out of. Storybook is one of those cool ideas, something that we love and blew our minds when we first landed on building components in isolation.
Yeah, so for me, it's been about as long, I think. Maybe, just about as long, I guess. I started thinking about open source more and more ever since I started using NPM way back when. And I always had like this idea of I want to contribute, but it's really hard to get into what exactly and like which project. Like there were so many and so much was going on that it's hard to get into. So the way I got into Storybook was because I used it. And I was building a little bit of an add-on for it regarding testing. And I learned that Storybook was unmaintained and I wanted to contribute. So 1 + 1 to me equals 2. And so I just posted on GitHub like, hey, if you're looking for a new maintainer, I'm willing to do it. Really just hoping that other people would do that as well. Turns out that they were looking for a new maintainer, and the next morning I was greeted by an email stating that I was the new administrator on Storybook's organization. So I just started trying to organize as many people as I could to get Storybook going again, and I guess the rest is history.
It's really funny how many open source stories start that way. I was really interested in this project and it just was no longer maintained and needed someone to contribute. And now I'm like helping run the show. This is a very similar story for me. It's just like working on a thing for work. And it was open source and then the maintainers weren't responding. And it's like, I really just wanted to get some changes. I was like, just let me, please, just give it to me. I'll take care of it.
Yeah, that's one of the tough parts too, right?
I actually got a similar start. My first open source project that I started help maintaining was GIMP. And literally there was just an open call for people to maintain it. I was like, I guess I can do it, but I did not know the amount of stress and like issues it would cause me.
Once you know how the sausage is made, it's really tough to get into volunteering that time. And oftentimes, like for me, it came from just not knowing how the sausage is made and kind of jumping in to the deep end. But I could see why it's like tough for people to like make that time in their lives. And especially when open source can take over more and more of your free time and work time.
Yeah, I've definitely been experiencing that now. I recently left Intuit and I now work at a startup, and like the amount of energy I have after work to do open source things is crazy different than when I was working at Intuit, where I could say, oh, Fridays I'll just work on open source. And none of that anymore.
Yeah. We use some of your tools, Andrew. We use Auto. And we use React, TypeScript, and DocGen. So absolutely, thank you. Big shout out to you.
Yeah, that's definitely my biggest package. I go look at the downloads sometimes and I'm like, oh my God. Like I got the idea for that plugin out of a GitHub issue and I was like, yeah, that sounds like it would work. And then eventually it got integrated into Storybook.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you guys mention Meteor, I always forget that you guys used to work on Meteor, and then when you say that again, I get excited. It's like this weird, like, tiny thread that connects me and a lot of developers I know is that we all kind of started out as Meteor was our first love in open source front-end tooling.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, like a lot of the folks that used to work at Meteor went on and did some cool stuff in the ecosystem. Yeah. Storybook is one of them. So I think you might have met Tom. Michael came out of Meteor. Evan Yu from Vue came out of Meteor. Apollo came out of Meteor. So some cool stuff in the JavaScript ecosystem.
I didn't know that Vue, that Evan Yu was from Meteor also. That's crazy.
Yeah. A long time ago. He was one of the first people I worked with there.
It was really ahead of its time. Like the things that it was really setting out, I felt like set the standard of what web tech would look like for the next several years. I'm investing a little bit more personal time into learning Elixir and Phoenix and playing around with Live View and a bunch of WebSocket stuff. And I always think back fondly to Meteor and thinking about the, what was it, the data diffing protocol or the data payload protocol, like DDP or something?
DDP.
Yeah. Good times. God, so nostalgic.
Yeah, it's funny that those ideas are definitely coming back strongly right now with like Blitz.js and Redwood.js. Full stack JavaScript out of the box is definitely something people are focusing on nowadays.
Yeah, it's one of those things like at that time, it wasn't quite right because there was a bunch of like invention of new tools like on every part of the stacks. You had a view layer, you had a data like layer, you had a backend, which was like an abstraction on top of MongoDB, like or integration on top of MongoDB. You had the isometric like stuff, which I'm not quite even sure what it means anymore. I've heard it so much. And even like a package manager, right? All of that was bundled into one tool. And the challenge with being bundled in one tool and how new the ecosystem was is like there's still so much exploration that had yet to be done, and as such that exploration could only be done by like just people banging their heads against the wall, like experimenting with routers, experimenting with view layers, experimenting with other parts, and thereby innovating like way faster than one group of people could even possibly do.
Yeah, even totally forgot about that part. My first package I ever published was to Atmosphere.
Yeah, I designed that.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and built that with the folks that work here. In fact, my co-founders.
Oh, wow. Small world.
Why don't we take a step back for a moment and talk a little bit more about Storybook, especially for the people who might be tuning in who haven't used it or aren't as familiar with it. Would one of y'all like to describe Storybook and sort of what the goal is with Storybook?
Yeah, sure. So Storybook is a different tool to different people because it's pretty flexible, but in its core, it provides a workbench for working on components in complete isolation. And the key word for Storybook, to me, at least as a developer and engineer, is really isolation and isolating one component from another. We all know that writing components is good, and writing isolated components, like they should be self-contained. We even write components sometimes with state and sometimes without state. Like we try to even isolate that behavior out of and extract out of separate components. But a lot of developers, they don't really have a workbench for like how to actually engineer all of those components separately. I see a lot of engineers just writing a page from top to bottom, top down. They start with the header, they create the logo and then the menu, and then they work their way down and down and down, and they create an entire page this way. Storybook gives you a way of breaking out of that. It gives you a way of going from bottom to the top. You start with your small components and you build up, and at some point you're kind of done composing your components and you end up on the screen that your product owner / designer wanted you to create. You can't really do that in your entire app because you don't really have a place to do that. Like you don't have a workbench. So once you have something like Storybook, a workbench, you can create many more components in parallel. You can literally get more developers working on the same page. So that's one of the core concepts of Storybook. And because you have this workbench, you can catalog. This is not a keyword for me for when I think about and talk about Storybook. It creates a catalog of all of your components. One problem that I have faced all the time when I was consulting was, all right, can you please provide me with like all of the possible states that this component can be in? What are all of the variants that exist? That way I know what I can create or what is missing, because I just got a huge design document, but I don't know what exists. To me, that is Storybook. I can see one component and all of its possible variants. Yeah, that also provide a place for if I need to create a new variant, I now know where to place it. And to me, that gives a lot of structure to my code and makes me write better components too, because if I think about my component in isolation and how its API service should be and its interface should be, then I start using it in the proper place. Whereas if you're writing a page top to bottom, it very often, and it feels very easy to do, like, oh, I'll just pass along all of the data, and you don't really think about what does this component need and how do I create the proper composition.
And once you have your components and the edge cases mapped out as stories, it doesn't take much squinting to see, oh, these are your test cases for your test environment, right? And so Storybook also gives you the ability to do things like visual testing, aka comparing screenshots to each other to find UI bugs. It does things like integrates with testing library to help you unit test those exact same components that you've already built, and so on and so forth in the testing ecosystem. One thing that Norbert shined a light on me a couple of years ago was like, hey, if you build stuff in Storybook in this like component and story kind of model, you get a bunch of things for free. Things like testing, things like documentation, things like accessibility, like heuristics. And then on top of that, all the add-ons that folks are creating in the ecosystem, integrations with Figma, integrations with Adobe XD, integrations with MSW, which is like a mock service worker library, and so on and so forth. And so all these things like are just come out of the box if you write stories.
I like to call that like story as a primitive. Once you have your story as a primitive, it unlocks all of those use cases. If you have your components use cases in that very defined structure, it's very easy to go, well, that's a test case. That's a visual test case. That's a piece of documentation.
Yeah, the stories of primitives, like that's a cool thing, because a couple of years ago, Michael Schillman and Tom Coleman and Norbert here innovated on what stories are with component story format, which is like this ES6 module-based format that allows stories to be super portable. So there's no like lock-in with Storybook when you use it. You can use those stories with whatever other tool you end up using in your tech stack.
That's not just like purely hypothetical, right? Because we actually see tools using component story format. It's not just Storybook that uses this. Other tools are using this as well.
Yeah, Intuit built one. We have a test runner built on that format. It's really cool to see you guys like shift Storybook's API to that story as a primitive thing, because before with the stories of an ad, like that was way different and so much more like overhead. Like the new ES6 API is almost, it's obvious once you did it. It's like, oh, you could just export a function just like normal, and now you have a component that you can use elsewhere.
Yeah, that kind of gives me a nice bridge, because I think the next extension of component story format is args. You've probably already used it, Andrew. Dom, I know you're familiar with it. I don't know about you, Justin. It is short for arguments, and you almost don't even need to write stories, because for the most part, a story is a component combined with data. And so what component story format allows you with args is you pretty much only really have to define your data. And then if you define your data this way, then Storybook can also render a control for your data, which is amazing because not everyone is a developer, and designers particularly, and then I'm talking to you, Dom, we both love it. You get to control your data right in Storybook, and that allows you to experiment with it. And you can find those very, very weird edge cases. Like you write stories to explore your edge cases, but there's always more edge cases. Like what happens if your button contains a really long text string? Or what happens if your list of items contains 0 items? These things you can now explore interactively in Storybook as well. Something that we're really keen on exploring in the future is, well, what if you play around with those controls and you can hit save, and it generates a new story for you.
For our listeners who might not know, what is a control and how is that expressed in Storybook?
Yeah, a control is a dynamically generated knob that allows you to adjust things, data and state in your component just by touching or like clicking on a UI. And that means you don't have to jump into the code to evaluate things like really long strings or different shapes of data. I think the core thing for args and is that if you take a step back and look at what a component is, right? A component is like a function of props and state at the end of the day, aka data. And with args, now we have like a first class concept in Storybook that mirrors what components actually are under the hood. It's logic that take data and state as arguments and then outputs a rendered UI. And when we can bring that to the users, whether they are developers, designers, product owners inside of Storybook, then that means, first of all, we don't know what comes out of that, but what is interesting that could come out of that is just more people getting involved in the UI, more people getting involved in like understanding how a user interface ends up being rendered. And that can only yield, I think, good things for me. If I'm using myself as an example, understanding how a component is made helps me design better.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key strengths of Storybooks is that it really brings developers and designers' workflows together, and it makes a lot more collaboration happen. Where else has Storybook brought those two people together in a good way? Like, I know Docs is like a real cool win.
A lot of people ask about this. Can I use Storybook as a documentation tool as well? Whereas as an engineer, for me, it is really about the workbench, but I also understand that if someone else is supplying components to me to use, I actually need to look up their documentation all the time. Stories are documentation, but when you're really close to the same code base, then you look at stories in a different manner. When you're further away, like for example, you're using a open source component library, if they just directly expose all of their individual stories, it's not super useful. What you're more interested in is an explanation of like, well, this is the core concept of the components. This is one variant and you use it this and that situations. Here's another variant that you might want to use in such cases. This is more of a documentation page, which is why Storybook supports MDX. And you can use your stories in your MDX files. In fact, you can even specify your stories in MDX itself. Storybook doesn't really mind if you reference the stories, or it can also extract the stories out of MDX directly. The idea is you have a single source of truth, which is your stories, and then you can either present them as isolated components, or you can compose them into a docs page.
That was one of the huge selling points for Storybook at Intuit was before the docs add-on, we literally had a WordPress site that had embedded PNGs of like specs, not even like real components, just PNGs of the specs. And we had to update that also. But like that, the add-on docs really unified that experience. And now we do have that single source of truth where if you want to know what the design system supports, you go to the Storybook, you read the docs, and then we tried to cater it to both designers and developers and build it to be a good tool for both of those targets.
When you think about it, your component stories are the baseline documentation for UI. And really what the docs capabilities in Storybook, they extend that further by being able to auto-generate things like props tables for a bunch of different frameworks, the ability to add pros in Markdown and inject them alongside of your live components. In addition to that, something that I saw from you, Andrew, when you were working into it, you extended those patterns too, because you could build your own components that integrated into Storybook docs, aka doc blocks. And that allowed you to get the flexibility of a more fully featured CMS, while also getting the automation of a tool that understands what your components are, that understands how they work and their arguments and their data and the shape of their APIs, and can automate a lot of the boring work of documentation. One of the key things for docs was that like it's automatic. If you're like me and you visit a tool's docs or like UI's docs and they're out of date, right? if one thing is out of date, it starts eating away at you. Like, what else is out of date? Is the whole thing out of date? Like, does this tool even work? So we kind of remove that kind of anxiety as like a design systems maintainer or component library maintainer, or even like just a UI developer. We remove that anxiety of having to always keep these docs up to date because we just automatically do it for you.
Something that a lot of people tell me is that maintaining their storybook is a lot of work. I think it's a net gain for most people. I think everyone here agrees for sure, but some people don't. And they think keeping their storybook up to date is a lot of work. But honestly, I think a lot of those people are maybe still writing things top down and then later writing storybooks retroactively. But if you think about it, like maintaining a site, like you said, with a lot of PNGs, that's a lot of work. Writing all of those unit tests with snapshots attached to them is a lot of work. And I think Storybook actually eliminates a lot of work and more work than it takes. And to me, it doesn't really take more work to be writing stories. In fact, I find that a lot of work I could not do if it wasn't for Storybook. And that's maybe a little bit weird, but if you think about what some components need in terms of data, it can be really hard to get that data from a real app. An easy example would be a timeout, a component that shows when something has timed out. Well, how would you reach that state in your real app? Like, are you gonna enable some sort of reverse proxy and get it to time out? Like, now you're waiting 60 seconds for your component to render? To me personally, the thing I'm working on for Chromatic right now, just to name an example, I need an account that is logged into both GitHub and GitLab and with our own username and password. And it's really hard to get a user like that. So in Storybook, I don't need to do that at all. All I have to do is provide the component with the right data. So much easier, so much less work to actually get that set up.
That's kind of what we're seeing in the larger ecosystem. Storybook now has like however many, like tens of thousands of stars. What that is like a testament to like this community of developers realizing that building stuff in isolation, building UIs specifically in isolation, is the pattern to make UI development not suck, to actually make it a manageable, satisfying, good experience. Because in the past, how would I have like done what Norbert was talking about? Well, I'd have to like get into my app, either provide a bunch of fixtures for that data, put it on a staging server, do a bunch of contortions and gymnastics to get my app into the right state and the right user and the right blah. That takes like a hell of a lot of spin up work, right? Like just to set it up initially, only to like work on one part of the UI, like really one component, like that, like a drop down menu. And think about how many times you'd have to do that again and again for loading states, for error states, for any type of complexity. It just gets out of hand. Like even marketing sites benefit from this because they also tend to have like some very primitive data requirements. The alternative isn't appealing. And I think that's what our community members are realizing and why the Storybook is becoming so popular. It's like the alternative sucks. So like let's do something that doesn't.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how Storybooks as a tool promotes good development practices. So React and other frameworks have been pushing this notion of separating this idea of what a presentation of a particular aspect of UI should be versus like what the business logic of the UI is in that state. So often in my own experience, that becomes like a forcing function, especially if you're doing storybook driven development where you're like building your components first in Storybook. Oftentimes you're building the things that you need to power that piece of UI, and then you'll have a wrapping component or some context or some other integration that comes later to give it the sort of rich business logic. So it is easy to get things in visual states because you're just driving the UI. I think the new format definitely helps drive that forward even more. And the ARGs thing sounds really interesting. I was just like, while you were talking about that earlier, I was thinking in my head, I was like, oh, this could give you the opportunity to do some like fuzzy UI testing. Because oftentimes there are like weird visual states in which a component breaks. It's like, oh yeah, this has really, really long text. But maybe if you just had a way to track like oh yeah, we're just going to give this component these different pieces of data. It's like easier to test. Yeah, pretty interesting. So speaking of testing, Chromatic is a company that helps maintain Storybook. It is really focused on this notion of visual testing. So Dom, why don't you tell me a little bit about like what was the inspiration for creating that and how's it going?
Chromatic is the company behind Storybook. We maintain it. Chromatic offers cloud services alongside of Storybook that do things like publish, version, access control, visual testing, UI review, and it solves a suite of other problems that Storybook users typically encounter, the heart of which is around like feedback and testing. So talking about testing, visual testing is this idea. It's not new. First of all, we didn't invent the idea of comparing screenshots to each other and detecting changes. But what we figured was that, like, hey, in this new world, as we're moving towards components and component-driven development practices, component-driven UIs, also seeing the design tool and design industry moving towards component-driven UIs as well, like they have components as a first-class construct there, we realized that, like, hey, what you actually want to visual test is components. In the past, you were visual testing pages. And what that meant was that was fine for like marketing sites. That was fine for like content sites because you could take a snapshot of a page and compare it screen to screen. But that doesn't really work in component-driven UIs because if you make a change to one component, so too will maybe like 50 pages change, maybe like 100 pages change. And Norbert, you're raising your hand.
Yeah. I would argue that it doesn't actually work for marketing sites either because your content constantly changes. And so you're not visually regressing your components. You're constantly visually regressing your data, which is by design changing. And like you're approving a lot of things that it just creates a lot of noise.
Yep. And so what visual testing at the component level does, it allows you to understand and pinpoint what has changed in the component hierarchy and see how any changes in the component hierarchy can cascade to other layers when, for instance, like a button changes. Like, how does that affect a credit card form? How does that affect a composite component? How does that affect all the buttons on the site? So that's where this visual testing of components came from and why we were so excited to offer that to the world. The other stuff that Chromatic does is solves a challenge that I face all the time around this job that I have to do called UI review. And that's the part after I implement a UI, so I can code my way out of a box. I implement a UI, and I have to share it with a bunch of other people, right? You share it with your designer, you share it with your product owner, you share it with perhaps like your accessibility specialist, and so on. The list goes on, right? Everyone has an opinion about UI, it turns out, because it's so visual and it's so close to what the user ends up seeing. And when you share it with everyone, like in the past, how did you get feedback? Maybe your CEO sent you a Slack message. Maybe your product owner added a Jira ticket for you to do something. People sent you emails. People sent you GitHub messages. You're getting bombarded as a UI developer from all different directions with like feedback and requests. And not to mention like some of this feedback isn't even on the version of the component that you actually care about, right? It's on like an old design, like final 3 of your UI implementation. What Chromatic also helps you do is like gives you a shared workspace for all of these people to come in and give you feedback on implementation. That makes your job as a UI developer way easier because it not only is all the implementation in one place, the actual things that people are talking about constantly stay up to date because Chromatic publishes your storybook in the cloud and keeps that up to date. It's almost like a universal reference point for any new feature that you build or any new piece of UI that you're proposing.
That seems like another natural step in bringing those designer and developer workflows together. When you're working in like something like Sketch or Figma, you can actually comment on specific parts of the UI. The fact that that comes to the actual code review process just makes the transition seamless.
Exactly. When you think about the most popular design tools today and other handoff tools like Zeppelin and Abstract, like really what their value proposition, right? Like it's not painting pixels. Painting pixels is shared amongst all of them. Really what they're talking about and what they're selling is the collaboration aspect and getting consensus on what is going to be built. And when you think about as a UI engineer, how do you do that? Why don't we have these tools too, right? Like, how do we get consensus on the UI that's going to get actually shipped? We're even closer to the end user than any other discipline, whether it's product owner, designer, or executive. We're the closest people to the end user, but why don't we have this like suite of tools that help us like collaborate and help us like test and maintain our UIs? That's what Chromatic is trying to solve.
Yeah, that's awesome. We had a conversation about this in our last episode where this notion of bringing designers closer to developer tooling is a very powerful thing, because the inverse thing where you bring in developers to design tools is great, but it's so far removed from the ultimate like process of shipping the thing.
My colleague Hart says all the time, software is never done. Right?
Yeah.
There's always this process, like ongoing iteration. And so it almost feels like a mistake to think about design developer collaboration as like discrete pieces of like, I design stuff in my design tool and then I hand it off in my handoff tool and then I build it out in Storybook. Well no, there's another like loop. There's the rest of the loop to kind of like think about, which is like what happens after I implement it, what happens after I ship it, and then what happens when someone else decides to come in and maintain this or change it or tweak it. So once the design's being done, it's just the first part in like a never-ending loop.
We actually have a special word for software that is done. It is deprecated.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. End of the life cycle. There's an interesting business opportunity here to close that loop. It's like, okay, you've developed now something. Now we need to iterate on it. It's like, how do you get the things that's in Storybook connected to the things that's in Figma to communicate those differences? It's interesting. I want to talk about one thing before we move on to the next question, though. It's just that there's been a lot of conversations about how hard it is to fund open source. There's been a lot of companies who have struggled with this. And I like to think of Mongo as an interesting story where it's like, hey, we're going to open source this thing. They're a little bit different because they're like this product that they're selling is their whole sort of open source business with, support tacked on top. But it's challenging. So could y'all talk a little bit briefly about like how this journey of creating a company that's really founded on open source software that like adds on top of it, like how has that been working out for you? What do you see as the sort of future of funding open source?
Yeah, that's a tough question because like it seems like that question is being legislated on Twitter and like in GitHub discussions in private channels endlessly, and there are a bunch of different ways, but none of them really stand out as a winner. I can describe our way, and perhaps that shines a bit of light on how we think about it. Our business model is straightforward. We build an open source project to scratch our own itch. We build commercial tools alongside of that open source project that don't really belong in open source because they have like cloud components to them. They have access control that we need to like keep track of your account and secure your account. So we build those cloud tools, we sell those cloud tools, and then we use that money to build more stuff that scratches our own itch in open source land. And that life cycle just continues and continues. And hopefully along the way, we make the UI development better for everyone just by continuing that life cycle. But I don't quite know how every other company is planning to do that. I think we're lucky because we have like the confidence of our customers and they pay us money to build stuff that gives them a bunch of value, and they continue paying us money because they have that confidence in us. And yeah, shout out to customers. We really love you. And yeah, that helps us build more open source stuff.
I think Storybook's story is a little bit unique in the open source world, considering Chromatic or Chroma doesn't actually own Storybook at all. Storybook pre-exists Chroma by quite a few years. So
like a year.
All right, a year. So Chroma doesn't own Storybook's identity. It doesn't own the repository. It really is an open source project where everyone is welcome and can contribute and voice their own opinions. We have a steering community that does have more people than just of Chroma employees, and we make sure that it stays that way. What we're trying to achieve is a good open source project that is welcoming and Of course, Dom, me, and Michael, for example, we contribute to the Storybook code base a lot, and we have our agenda, but we also welcome other people's agendas in the Storybook community and code base. A lot of the stuff that we do in Storybook's code base doesn't really make 100% business sense. Like, we have competing open source tools that compete with Chromatic, but it's, yeah, like Dominic says, certain things don't really belong in the open source because, like the things you mentioned, if you want to do and run everything on your own local machine, yeah, you can run story shots and you can create a image of every story. We have tools, open source tools that do just that for you.
We've even built some of those tools.
We have, yes, we have, and we maintain them, which is actually more work than just building them.
We see ourselves as like conduits for the good ideas in the rest of the community. And often those good ideas are something that we have never thought about. And that, in our role as conduits, that allows us to promote the best things forward. That's what keeps the community so vibrant. And that's why we have, like, I think over 1,300 contributors now and continue growing.
I think that's one of the things that really makes Storybook stand out. I frequently say to many, many people that Storybook is one of the most welcoming open source communities out there. Like, literally, I think I messaged Norbert like a few years ago, and he's like, yeah, let's hop on a Zoom, and I want to meet you, and then I'll give you publish access. It was like a completely different experience. And even that extends to pull requests. Like, I've seen many a time, somebody puts up a pull request, they like stick around for it for maybe a week or two, and then business needs or their job gets in the way and they can't really take it over the finish line. And then I'll see one of the core Storybook contributors actually pick it up, push a few commits to make it ready for merge, and then actually merge it, which is super awesome to see.
Yeah, I think it's totally understandable that people contribute to an open source project, but they can't be bothered because of time or interest to take it to the 100% that is required of a large open source project. Like, Storybook tries to be backwards compatible to a sane degree, and it must have a good README to a sane degree. It must have a change log and a migration log, etc., etc. There's a lot of administrative work that goes into having a good and welcoming open source repository. But not everyone can take it to that 100%. And so I think it just makes sense for maintainers to like take those 99% PRs and take them to 100 and get them merged. Only makes sense to me. I actually enjoy that process a lot, and I think it's very nice, and people are super appreciative of you taking that 99 to 100.
There's another element here that speaks to the larger kind of maintenance effort of these open source projects. And I've been able to see the inside of like 3 of them now, where the actual work isn't, the fun work is building stuff, right? That's like the tip of the iceberg. It's that small, like a little hill that you see from a distance, like above the water. But below that iceberg, underneath the water, is like the rest of like the maintenance work, release management, keeping things up to date with the rest of the ecosystem. Things like Webpack 5, React 17, Vue 3, that have significant API changes that affect how people use Storybook and use that tool. That's where the work of maintainers comes in. It's the integration stuff that allow our users to have the most seamless migration possible, no matter what tool they use. So if they decide to upgrade to Vue 2 to Vue 3, easy. If they decide to change from Vue 3 to React or Svelte or Angular, God forbid, then that's easy too. We love Angular. We're going to support Angular Ivy soon in the next couple of months. But what I'm saying is that we do this integration work so you don't have to. So you can just use Storybook, build components, have a great time, and you don't have to worry that these things are going to break or these things are going to go out of date. At least with Storybook, you might have to do that with the rest of your app, but when you integrate, when you add Storybook, you can be sure that it'll be up to date with the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah, this also explains why Storybook must be such a welcoming space for new contributors and contributors in general, because we really desperately need these people to contribute. I just don't understand Angular or Vue myself, but Storybook still contains it, and we still need to have everything work and be upgraded, as Don was saying. And that takes a lot of mental capacity that I personally can't fit in my own headspace. So that's what we need contributors for, to help us understand these tools. 2-3 years ago, I didn't understand TypeScript at all. Now I'm a huge fan, but back then I didn't. I think a testament to Storybook community success has been our TypeScript migration that originated from us supporting Angular. Angular 2 was built using TypeScript and Storybook and React was not. But that evolved over time, and the Angular developers and maintainers of Storybook, we mingled, and now all of Storybook's code base is TypeScript. And if it's up to me, then soon Chromatic's code base will also be.
Yeah, that's fun. What other experiences have y'all had in scaling contributions and managing a large community? Because like Storybooks is such a big, expansive project and hits so many different technologies. And as is the case with most every open source project, you're a relatively small team working and trying to scale this thing out. So how do you do it? What's the experience like on the day-to-day? What are the biggest challenges? Just curious about insight on that.
It's kind of like we're building the ship and also like sailing. So in some ways, like we are trying to keep it afloat by doing this like base layer of maintenance while supporting more and more new tools. We can't do that without the rest of the community and the rest of the folks like working together. When you have larger communities, all of those people need to talk to each other or need to communicate. We have amongst the main maintenance and especially the core maintainers, the most context on all the different parts. So rather than like trying to build every single different part, we try to connect people that have similar challenges to each other and enable them to build on top of Storybook. What that says about the core maintainers is like really what we're doing is like defining core APIs, defining things like component story format that other people can then build upon. And in some ways, like them building upon it is the fun work. They're doing dope stuff, and like we get to watch it with like, you know, as like soccer dads on the side of the field, saying like, yeah, cool, like you scored a goal, that's awesome. What's it like for you, Norbert?
I remember in the beginning where I was reading every single issue that came in NPR, but at some point that became impossible for me to go through everything. I've definitely hit a period a year ago or so back where I just became a little bit too much. This is when I talked to Dom and Zol and Tom, like, hey, could I maybe migrate a little bit towards the Chromatic side of things where things are just a little bit slower going and we got longer term projects going on. And recently I've been kind of migrating back and getting back into the Storybook side of things. That's kind of how it's been for me. I still have an open Calendly, which is like someone else can schedule a Zoom meeting with me, which I post freely. Anyone can schedule a meeting with me to talk about Storybook, and if their main question is like, what can I do to help? Or, hey, could you help me understand this bit so I can contribute? Like, love doing those meetings. Those are usually the highlight of my day. We have Michael, who is just amazing at managing the entire project. He responds to, I think, pretty much every issue, every PR. He does every release that we do of Storybook. Yeah, I would not want to be in his shoes. He's doing such an amazing job at
but he wants to be in
Storybook.
his shoes.
He wants to have those shoes, and he fits them very well.
And then, yeah, we have a bunch of other team members doing in various facets of the team too. We have Joao on documentation, so maintaining that. That's like a full-time job, which is like the surface area of Storybook's API is like huge, and what its capabilities are huge. And we're constantly adding more new features. We have Varun on DX, developer experience. He's like kind of articulating and helping people understand why Storybook does the things that it does and how to use Storybook to do things like testing, things like component development, things like documentation, and a bunch of other maintainers that kind of lift us up as well. Yeah, those are to name a few. There are many, many others. I can't call them. I know them by name, but we don't have enough time in this episode to really just go through them all.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for the perspective. So, Dom, you had mentioned seeing some really cool things. What's your favorite thing that you've seen come out of the community?
There's a lot. Okay, so Norbert, you go first.
I got a good example. So it's not a new add-on. It has existed for quite a long time, but I think it's a really great example of extending Storybook beyond its original parameters, which to me is the accessibility add-on. I really, really like the concept of it. I want to take that add-on so much further. In fact, once I'm done with some of this chromatic work that I'm currently working on, I plan on taking a very careful look at that add-on and probably extract certain things that it does into the core itself, the core of Storybook. Like, I think the main feature of this add-on should be extracting data from the story, and then it really should be Storybook's responsibility for showing this data. I think the less work add-on creators need to do, the better. So that means extending Storybook's capabilities by quite a bit again. And this also feeds back into Chromatic. We actually plan on taking this extracted data and graphing it over time in Chromatic as well, so that you can not just diff what the component looked like before and after, but also you can see, hey, am I improving or decreasing my accessibility score over time?
A lot of the things that happen are in the add-on ecosystem. First thing off the top of my head is Nguyen, a fellow maintainer, just released a testing library integration that allows you to easily extract Storybook stories and drop them directly into testing libraries. So you don't have to, it's just like ergonomically a super powerful tool. You write stories once, you reuse them in tests, you don't have to think about it. Varun has some really cool add-ons that he's making, things that are all around like CSS debugging and CSS layout. As a UI developer, that's kind of like all I do is what it feels like. I'm like, hey, does that like line up right, or is this the right spacing? So he's building tools like that help you visualize alignment in Storybook, helps you measure the distances between like headings and titles, distances between DOM elements. Those are the two exciting ones that have come recently. And then there's like an endless list of mocking add-ons that like are new integrations with Storybook. And then of course the design tool add-ons, which are constantly being innovated on. I think UX Pin has a really cool one that we've seen recently that allows you to take stories that you've written in Storybook and import them into your design tool so that you can just design with real life story data. As a designer, that's catnip for me because I don't have to maintain like a static component library and a Storybook anymore, which Storybook is the source of truth. It's the code. I can use Storybook's component library or store any UI inside of Storybook in my design tool itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, closing that loop is like, to me, the holy grail of front-end UI development. Getting it to where like designers, developers in their tools are both perfectly synced. It's a very hard problem to accomplish, and there's like dozens and dozens of companies trying to.
Yeah, Andrew, you took a stab at that too, right? You had a sketch add-on. You had a couple of cool projects.
My attempts got me to maybe 95%, but you really want like that 100%, especially at such a large company. So like we eventually moved away from Sketch and our designer started using Figma. So what ended up happening is they maintain a Figma component library that is very robust. And I don't think I could ever generate from code to make as robust as that. Maybe we can in the future, who knows? But that workflow worked pretty well for us.
I think that too, another cool thing that I've seen and actually used in the past was Ink, which is like a React renderer for the CLI. And I think Gert, who is my colleague at Chroma, he decided not to use it, but he did actually decide to use Storybook for the CLI that we use for Chromatic. So we actually have stories for what the CLI does and looks like for the Chromatic CLI when you run and upload your Storybook to Chromatic. Like that to me is also really cool. Yeah, it's amazing. And like actually we caught bugs in our CLI thanks to this, and we have visual regression on our CLI because of this. I don't think many people can actually say that.
That's wild, and I love it.
There's some really cool stuff going on in the ecosystem as well, like inspirational stuff that's not necessarily Storybook, but what's built in Storybook. Someone made a Windows 95 UI component library, so you can build a Windows 95 UI. Someone, I think Intuit, y'all made like a DevTools component library, so you can build things that look like Chrome DevTools, but in Storybook or in the web interface. There's some folks that are doing like 3D stuff, so integrating Storybook with, I think 3JS is the 3D library, and so all of a sudden you have like textural mapping and reflections and three-dimensional space. And when you think about it, like the whole isolated component development is perfect for three-dimensional stuff, because you want to be able to reproduce a UI state through data and props. Storybook is that tool that helps you like quickly get to what does this look like on the z-axis when it's positioned like this, and like the object is extruded like that.
Yeah, the concept of isolated component development, it's exciting to see it like translate to all these different domains. Like I never knew about the terminal. That's crazy. Another use case we have it into it. A few of my coworkers made a Storybook native experience a little bit better. It'll render natively into like actual phones in your Storybook, so you can develop your mobile components in just the same way as you do as your web components.
That's the exciting part of the web too. Like we get to innovate on the newest patterns and the newest like dev like workflows. That's probably why you have this podcast, devtools.fm, right? Where we get to see the future a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Shall we go into our tooltips for the week?
Yep.
Andrew, you want to kick us off?
My first tooltip of the week is Loopback. This really isn't a developer tool. What it allows you to do is to combine multiple sources of audio from different apps into one source and then use that as an input to another. So that may have sounded really confusing, but so the example up here they have on their website is they take Apple Music and the microphone and create a new virtual device out of that. And what you can do with that virtual device is use it like in Zoom. So if you wanted to have background music in your Zoom call for some reason, you could use this to do it. And what I've used it for is there's this other app called Crisp.ai that removes background noise from audio. And I literally routed the audio from my editing tool into a virtual device and then used that virtual device as input to Crisp. And then I was able to actually run the background noise removal on pre-recorded audio, which helped with editing some of these episodes.
It's a super cool tool. I love their interface too. Very visual. Pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's very visual. It harkens back to Justin's love of visual programming tools. You get to connect things to other things. It's a fun little experience.
It's so true. Textual programming is very powerful, very terse, but also not everything is really best displayed in text. So on Twitter this week, saw this really interesting blog post from Stack Blitz. So Stack Blitz is a service that gives you an online editor. So you can think of it like GitHub Code Spaces or like Code Sandbox, similar sort of thing. They just released this feature called Web Containers, which actually will run your service in the browser. So it's like you have Node.js running a GraphQL API, it will run it in the browser. This isn't necessarily totally unique. So Code Sandbox actually runs a lot of stuff in the browser. I've contributed to that in the past, and it's really interesting how they take their approach. And it's a lot of web workers and like loading things in web workers and trying to coordinate everything. But I think there's some really interesting things going on with these web containers, and I think there's some very clever usage of what I expect to be WebAssembly actually running these things more natively in the browser. So really, really fascinating project. You can imagine being able to spin up a Storybooks application directly in the browser, everything running in the browser without having to like npm install anything or go through that process. So really, really fascinating technology. We'll link the blog post where they intro it in the show notes, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's cool to see all these tools trying to lower the barrier to entry to development. Same goes back to Replit, which we talked about last week. Very, very similar.
One of my tooltips is Mock Service Worker. Provides API mocking that help you quickly and easily just mock data inside of components and UIs. Works with Storybook as well. There's an add-on. There's some UIs that are intertwined with data, like inextricably intertwined with data, right? Something that calls out a third-party API, aka like Stripe credit card form, right? It can be tough to build in isolation, but you want to build them in isolation because like you get all these other benefits of building in isolation. And what Mock Service Worker does is that it spins up a service worker in your browser, intercepts requests, HTTP requests, and stubs in responses of your choosing. It's pretty easy to do things like you stub in a response for whatever API that you need to mock.
I really love tools like this. So I was actually going to share this one this week myself. There's this interesting story around testing in particular, where it's like the layer that you test in matters a lot. And a lot of people over the years have expressed, oh, you should write your code in a way that like your individual functions can have dependency injection and like you're writing your code to be testable. And as a result of that, often the code gets really hairy. It gets really hard to follow. It's not the easy path of like, oh, this function just does this one little simple thing. It's like, oh, well, we're doing a dependency injection in this way, and it's got this interface adapter that we use to like do this blah, 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 blah. And it becomes, you write testable code that becomes very hard to reason about over time. And so tools like this mock service worker that kind of goes really, really, really low level and just says, okay, what are the exact primitives that you need to work with? Another tool in this vein is mockfs, which is a library on NPM. Actually, I put in a pull request to Auto a while back to do this because mockfs says you're reading some files from the file system. The functions that you are using and like how you access them, you don't want to mock those out. Those are all implementation details, but you want to say the file system has these files. And I find that super, super low level of just like, I expect that this resource or this API or this file exists with this content and I want it to do this thing can be so much more powerful to your development environment, because it also means that you don't have to think about doing a ton of crazy dependency injection. You could write your code the simple way and also test it in a non-fragile way. And I think that's the holy grail for me.
Yeah, in some ways, like testing is moving towards like testing the horizontal layers of the stack, things like the UI in isolation, the data layer in isolation, the backend in isolation. I think microservices already, and like with Docker containers, and the backend engineers have already figured this out. But now we're getting into this like front end and UI layer, and tools like Mock Service Worker, Mirage.js, they help you like do the same thing that engineers in other parts of the stack are doing, except for our part of the stack, which is UI.
So last week I was pairing with someone and they didn't have this enabled, and I immediately realized how useful this is. So if you have a bunch of brands or objects nested in each other, by default all of the characters are white, and it's sometimes really hard to match up which one matches up to which one. Now you can go like click on it and then VS Code will tell you where the other one was, but what if there was a way to just color code them differently based on like which one matches? So bracket pair colorizer is that VS Code plugin that does that. And yeah, like I said, it can be very, very useful, particularly if you're writing your code in a really functional way where there's lots of brands and lots of arrow functions nested in other arrow functions that also have returning objects. Yeah, it's a really small but very useful tool. Makes it much easier for me to read the code that I write.
I've used this one a lot. It really helps debugging. Like how I write my code after Prettier is I'll write it as ugly as possible, and sometimes I'll miss like a paren, and this is critical in helping me debug those situations.
It's got like 5 million downloads or something.
Yeah, it's crazy. My last dev tooltip, this one is really not development related at all, but in the new release of macOS Big Sur, they changed their icons from being just like icons in your dock to kind of looking more like iOS icons, and not every tool has transitioned to that paradigm yet. So this is a website where it's literally just icons built for Mac OS Big Sur, and you can make your dock look really pretty and have all the same shape of icon. It's not that hard to change the icon either. It might seem like a little bit of work, but it's not too much. For example, Spotify is a great example of how not to do a Big Sur icon. You don't just put your circle in the app square. What I think you should do is make your logo become that square, and it looks a lot nicer to me.
It's pretty cool. Yeah, I'll make this one my last one for today. This is another big announcement that I think was this week. So this company called PlanetScale started the beta of their product. This is a really interesting service that gives you like a Vercel development experience with databases. So you can have a pull request that updates a schema and get a sort of database instance for that pull request, and they handle the migration and everything for you. It's built on this technology called like Vitis or something. I don't know exactly what that's called. This is huge. I'm really interested and excited to see where this technology goes, because this has been a tremendous gap in the ecosystem for a while. And there are a lot of interesting services that are popping up. FaunaDB has been like this like serverless provider for a while, but in my opinion, their API is pretty complex and it's hard to get into that tool. PlanetScale is using, it's essentially MySQL under the hood. So if you've worked with databases, this should be very familiar for you. So anyway, probably one of the most exciting database companies that I've seen in a while. Supabase is also really exciting, but this one for a very different reason.
Nice. Yeah, I've definitely experimented with Fauna before, and it was pretty cool. But the concept of automated migrations, sign me up.
Yeah, it's not a problem you think you'll have when you start on your serverless journey, but databases are a huge problem. I manage a website called kickback.tv, which is basically just a fancy RSS reader for music videos. And how I do it is by spinning up thousands of parallel serverless functions to scan blogs. And my biggest problem has been connecting to a database. And it's nice to see more solutions come out for that type of use case.
My second tooltip is a tool called Measure that is currently being in prototype phase, but it should come out with Storybook 6.3. And what it does is it measures the distances, margin, padding, dimensions of the box model, visualizes them in a canvas overlaid on top of the actual UI. And what that helps you do is check for spacing and check for the distances between elements really quickly inside of Storybook. If you're a UI developer like me, you tend to do this all the time. And in fact, like I do this for most of the time. It's just, this spacing doesn't look quite right. This spacing doesn't look quite right. This gives you, at a click of a button, the ability to see what that spacing is.
Yeah, I've seen this idea evolve over the course of the years. I think the first time I saw it was with Adam Argyle's VisBug. He's a developer on the web dev team at Google, and it's a lot like this. And I think recently another Vercel engineer that works on the design systems front end had a blog post about this too. So it's cool to see it percolate throughout the ecosystem.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think InspectPix was that tool, and then VisBug definitely are inspirations as we build this out. We're trying to get this to more people so that everyone can get the benefit of checking spacing.
So a tool that we've been using in Storybook for a while is obviously ESLint. I think everyone here is familiar with it. So I'm not actually recommending ESLint because I think everyone is already using it. What I am recommending is check out DeepScan, which is, I don't know how they do it, but they are immensely fast at detecting things that might be wrong with your code. Things like you would have to configure ESLint with all sorts of presets or plugins. DeepScan just kind of automatically checks for you and tells you, like, hey, you're using a let here, but you're actually not redefining it anywhere. Or you are returning something here, but then you're not returning anything in the else clause in this function. Simple stuff that ESLint can catch for you, but running ESLint on your own machine can be quite a performance hog, and running ESLint over your entire code base can take a while. DeepScan is something you can run either as a GitHub action, or you can run it in VS Code itself, and it is just ridiculously fast.
This is definitely one I'm going to check out for our use cases. That this one little example they show here where you make a render function without actually returning your JSX, I do that all the time. It is so annoying doing that because the error message it gives you doesn't really tell you that you just did that. It's just kind of confusing.
But this one is a little bit out there. So this is actually one from the Ember community. I think this is one of the Ember core maintainers. And it is a tool called Mo, which is the opposite of ohm, which is probably a unit you might have heard of. It is the electrical resistance. And apparently Mo is the exact opposite of that. So it's like really allowing flow, which I think is really interesting. The tool is not ready for use, but it is an experiment of kind of a bundler that runs in your browser as well. So it's another one of those service workers tools. And this time it is essentially doing Babel's work and Webpack's work whilst you're requesting the files. And one thing that's been annoying me for a really long time is that the whole pipeline of publishing packages doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me. For example, for Storybook, we are currently publishing CommonJS, and we're also publishing ESM, and we're also publishing ESM, but without the regenerator runtime, because some people have more modern systems than others, and you can't really polyfill regenerator runtime once it's in, and it's just a syntax error if you try and invoke it. And I really think like this entire problem of like getting code and running it, it should be like near the consumer, or like essentially Babel's work should be as late as possible. And this seems to me like a tool that could take us into that direction. So I'm personally really excited for it. I know it's not production ready, but yeah, it's something that really, really excites me. Service workers taking care of the transpilation of your packages and making sure they're like offline capable. One of their core promises of Edward Faulkner, he's the guy who makes this and presented it at EmberConf last year, is that you don't need to do any npm install at all. You just spin up your app and it downloads it directly in the browser, which is, I don't know about you, but I do spend a lot of time downloading packages from npm, even if they're already in my Yarn cache, but apparently it just takes a trillion times to get everything copied over. And now my hard disk is full because it's got a billion versions of Lodash everywhere. It would be nice to not have that anymore.
We're definitely in a paradigm shift of this like CJS plus ESM to a big question mark, because lots of experiments and new setups are definitely going around. Yeah,
but like as I think everyone is aware at this point, like the JavaScript ecosystem is just a moving target. ESM is maybe the final evolution of the module format we'll have in JavaScript, but it's definitely not the last iteration of JavaScript, the language. It is still evolving. New features are being added every year, which is a great thing. And so we'll never be really done with migrating to the next version of JavaScript. So a tool like this that takes it to the end consumer, yeah, again, excites me really a lot. I'm hoping that will be a reality at some point.
For sure. Cool. Thanks for sharing those tools. That was awesome. Great episode today. Thanks, Dom. Thanks, Norbert. It was great having you on here. Storybooks is awesome. One of the best tools. So you are doing great work. Keep it up.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it for us today. All right. Until next time, y'all take it easy.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate y'all.